Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this web talk on security policy in Eastern Europe and Germany's role in this security policy within the EU and NATO. My name is Patrick Waltz. I'm responsible for the Civic Education program of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom in the states of Hessen and Rhineland-Palatinate. I'd also like to welcome you in the name of Dr. Frank Blechschmidt, the chairman of the Hessen-based Kay-Achim with which we cooperate. My team and I organized more than 200 events a year, but every now and then an event is much more than a job, but a reminder why I went into civic education, so please bear with me as I say a few words on my behalf. Nearly 20 years ago, I applied for and received the Go East scholarship and spent a term in Latvia. I had nearly finished my studies, and I mainly used this opportunity to travel Eastern Europe, relying on my shaky Russian and the hospitality of the people there. Traveling by bus and by train, I had lots of occasions to talk with people from all backgrounds, but I most vividly remember my stays in Kiev and Odessa, because young people chatted me up all the time. I was everywhere I went. They were simply approaching me and asking me most of the time in English, where are you from? And when I told them from Germany, they asked me, and what are you doing here? And this was honest curiosity, as well as a rather bleak view on their own country at that time, which they perceived as corrupt and badly governed. They were fed up with the past as well as the present, and they wanted it to change. And these impressions stuck with me when I returned to Germany, because, well, nowadays you would say I checked my privilege. I saw they wanted ownership for their own life, and I had it. And I went back to Germany deeply humbled by this experience. And a year afterwards, the Orange Revolution happened. And the people of Ukraine haven't really been able to catch a breath since then. And I often think back to these encounters, and I find myself asking how these people have fared throughout all these events. After Euromaidan and the annexation of Crimea by Russia, I also began noticing disinformation on social media, and it became even worse with the shooting down of MH17 and the killing of nearly 300 people. And to make this already long personal intro shorter, this was my personal line in the sand. And my anger at this orchestrated disinformation is what nudged me towards civic education, because I simply didn't want this disinformation to stay there and to poison our public debate. So here we are, watching as troops are being massed at the Ukrainian border with the intention to compel Ukraine to abandon its alignment with the West and to compel the West to abandon Ukraine. And we realized that security policy is not a relic from the Cold War, but it's still very much a necessity in the 21st century. And that the European Union, the member states of the European Union and Germany seem to struggle with a counter strategy to this blunt force or this blunt use of force within Europe. So which role does Germany think it fulfills within NATO? And what would other NATO members, especially in Eastern Europe, wish Germany would contribute? What are the guidelines of German security policy? Where is NATO heading in this standoff with Putin? What could and should Germany do to ease tensions in Eastern Europe? Frankly, I don't know. And that's why I'm glad I can introduce our expert panel who will discuss this topic with us. First of all, I'm glad to have Dr. Stefanie Babst with us. She's not only a former member of NATO's international staff for more than 20 years, but also a former Stipendiat of the Stiftung. Sorry, I'm lacking the word now. So she's an Altstipendiat, and she is now working as a free strategic consultant on international security issues. Dr. Babst, I'm glad to have you with us this evening. Then let me welcome Edward Lucas. Lucas has covered Central and Eastern European affairs for nearly 3 decades. and for more than 3 decades. And until 2018, he was a senior editor at The Economist. He's the author of several books on Eastern Europe, and he's also a candidate for the Liberal Democrats. Mr. Lucas, I'm very glad to have you with us this evening to share your expertise on Eastern Europe with us. The talk will be moderated by the journalist Dr. Christoph von Marschall of the Berlin daily Der Tagesspiegel, who has specialized on US affairs and served as US press correspondent until 2018, covering Bush, Obama, and Trump. He is now the chief diplomatic correspondent of Der Tagesspiegel. Dr. von Marschall, thank you so much for hosting this event. I wish us all a spirited talk, peace in our time, and Dr. von Marschall, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patrick, also for this very personal introduction, and you see what personal experience can matter in such situations that we have right now. Without further ado, I just would like to give you some technical information. First, we will have introductory statements of Stephanie and Edward, and I will ask some questions. And then you have also the opportunity to ask questions. Please use the F&A function and write your questions into the F&A, then I can read them and try to put to our guests. And now, without further ado, it's Stephanie who will now introduce us into the topic. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Thank you very much, Patrick. Hello, everyone, and good evening. Great to join this conversation. I'm very much looking forward to offer you a couple of observations on a topic which has become really a daily theme. The crisis provoked by Russia. And let me probably just make 2 or 3 intro remarks and then hopefully to have a good debate on this. The number 1 point I would like to make is that, even though it sounds a bit banal, but this crisis is indeed in full swing. It's very profound. It has many political and strategic dimensions to it. And it's very difficult to predict the outcome. It is a crisis that caught Western leaders by surprise, I would argue, even though it was not the first military show of force that the Kremlin has undertaken. But when Russia started to gather military troops big time along the borders of Ukraine in mid-November, I would argue that Western leaders really didn't expect that Russian President Putin would signal to them his preparedness to actually make the march and eventually attack Ukraine. Neither did they expect that he would basically throw at them a set of really far-reaching demands for restructuring and redoing the European security order. So in fact, we have these 2 things where Western leaders are struggling with how to possibly de-escalate the military show of force that we are currently seeing initiated by the Russians, and how to possibly respond to the set of, I wouldn't even call them proposals, but rather demands that the Kremlin has put forward. Looking at the way the new government in Berlin has responded, I'd say it would be probably fair to say that they're not the only one who were caught by surprise, but clearly the government who was just enthroned, quote unquote, in early December was ill prepared back in December. And this explains probably a little bit why it took them quite some time to actually get going and try to place their attention full speed on responding to the crisis. One should remember that the traffic light government in Berlin won elections primarily on the basis of their ecological transformation agenda, placing emphasis very much on climate change related economic, social, and environmental issues. Foreign and security policy, let alone hardcore military and security issues, didn't really play a major role in the election campaign. And looking at the party programs of our 3 party of the three coalition partners, I'd say you found a lot of mainstream thinking, but certainly not something, I mean, that suggested that they were prepared mentally and politically in order to focus full speed and full time on Russia. So instead of starting to execute their environmental driven program, their new coalition program, they had to grasp the magnitude of the profound crisis that started to unfold. And I'm mentioning this point because I think this explains, at least partly, why the German government was pretty below the radar screen before Christmas. You could hardly hear public statements. There was barely what I would call a strategic debate that I was able to recognize in Berlin. But after the New Year's, beginning of January, clearly ever since the new government is trying to speed up their diplomatic curve. Now, if you look at the German official position on the crisis, it also took a little bit of time to make that really crystal clear. What is it, I mean, that this government really thinks about the crisis? But it's clear now that Germany fully supports Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. They have taken a while to really make sure that they see Russia as the aggressor. They advocate a peaceful settlement and seek to explore all diplomatic means, including the Normandy format. So hence, I think we hear a lot about diplomatic support and activity in support of bringing back the Normandy format. And in the past 2-3 weeks, we see that the German government has started to engage in what I would call a speed dating or crisis diplomacy, going back and forth, trying to really help to close the ranks and hold the ranks. I think this is, politically speaking, if I look at the Western side, probably the most important challenge that we face. Namely, to really make sure that both EU countries, but also NATO countries, what we call the West as such, is really closed in terms of their ranks. And as we see, and we'll probably later on discuss, this is not a given. I have been frequently asked, does the new German government seek to play a lead role in trying to respond to this crisis? And I would argue that the very term leadership is a bit of a stranger to the Berlin vocabulary. I would certainly not assume that they would like to lead, but you see now, especially in the past few days, that the German-French cooperation is gaining speed, and they're trying to coordinate their efforts as closely as possible between Germany and Berlin. The critical issues that we have also seen arising both in the US debate, but also partly in Eastern Europe, clearly very much in Ukraine, has boiled down, in my at least humble view, to two issues. The first is the issue of, should Germany send weapons? Should they help to arm Ukraine? And the other is about the sanctions and the famous issue, why doesn't Chancellor Schröder, why doesn't he want to spell out that Nord Stream 2 is certainly a part of, or they should be part of, the sanction package that the Western allies are currently preparing.
Chancellor Scholz, not Scholz.
Scholz, sorry, what did I say? Sorry, Scholz. Scholz is currently preparing. So you can clearly, I mean, put arguments in favor. You could probably put arguments also against the issue of transferring weapons to Ukraine. I personally belong to those who would argue that it would probably make sense from a political point of view to make a gesture of political solidarity to the government in Kiev. From a purely military point of view, it would not change the equation between David and Goliath. Whatever we provide to the Ukrainians right now will not rebalance in favor of Ukraine, again, from a purely military point of view. But that's to be debated. But the fact that the German government didn't really put light on their rationale, on their decision making, I think also prompted the criticism that we have received and seen in the past. My last point, very quickly, if I look at the bigger picture right now, what I would certainly like to see is the German government making or participating in a debate about how to respond to the Russian demands, which were put in these two famous letters. How do we want to go about providing security guarantees, quote unquote, to Ukraine, something that French President Macron has indicated after his visit to Moscow. How do we go about the future of NATO enlargement? Do we really think, I mean, this is a complete no-go, or is this something that we would need to address at some point in time? I have not yet seen a lot of conceptual strategic reflections coming from Berlin, other than what NATO countries, including Germany, have put on a piece of paper and cabled back to Moscow in response to the letters coming from the Kremlin. But clearly the ball is currently in Moscow. We have to see how President Putin will react to the responses put forward by Washington and NATO. And in the meantime, I think we're going to see another continuous show of force on the Russian side, with the question mark about when, or if and when and under which circumstances the Russians would set their own red line. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, for outlining the situation. The West is caught by surprise, especially the new government in Berlin. One could even ask whether this was timed to the start of the new government. I just recall that we had a similar situation in last spring when we had a new US president. So probably Putin has this all in mind, who is new, who he can test. Maybe there are opportunities opening up or not. And then you put also the three questions on the table. Should Germany provide weapons? To which degree can the allies count on Germany's readiness to share all the sanctions? And the question of NATO membership for Ukraine, or I could ask also in a different way, neutrality Finland model that is the vocabulary Macron also mentioned coming back from Moscow. But without further ado, to Edward, please, Edward, comment and give us your perception of the situation, and then we will try to dig in a little bit deeper.
Well, thank you so much, Christoph, und guten Abend. Und ich bin wirklich ein Altstipendiat der Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung. Es freut mich sehr, an unserer Diskussion teilzunehmen. Und ich würde gerne auf Deutsch weiterführen. Ich weiß, es gibt auch einige Teilnehmer, die nicht Deutsch sprechen, weil sie schon auf Twitter kommentieren. Ich denke, daher ich sollte auf Englisch fortsetzen, obwohl es wirklich für eine Deutschveranstaltung mir ein bisschen komisch scheint. I want to start off, though, with a quote in German from a very important speech, a speech which really deserves to have a big place in German diplomatic history. And it was a speech given by the president of Estonia. And the president started off with Fürchte Gott, rede die Wahrheit, tue Recht und scheue niemand. And it was good he started off with this very important Hanseatic motto, because he had some very tough messages to deliver. He said that the West was getting Russia wrong, that there was wishful thinking, that Russia was not an ideal arbitrator or peacemaker in other states, given its own difficulties, that its attitude to the status of ethnic Russians in neighboring countries was highly destabilizing. He highlighted the irrationalism, as he put it, in Russian foreign policy and Russian political philosophy. Particularly this idea that Russia has a special role. He also criticized the realpolitik, as he put it, in the democratic West, the self-belief in realpolitik, which was actually just appeasement. He said the West was becoming an accomplice of imperialist forces in Russia, who believe they can solve their country's immense problems by outward expansion and threatening their neighbors. He said, if you really want to help Russia, you make it emphatically clear to the Russian leadership that another imperialist expansion will not stand a chance. And if you don't do that, you are helping the enemies of democracy. Now, I'd like to ask you, when do you think that speech was made? Maybe it was made after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. That would have been a good time to make it. Or maybe it was made after the attack on the war in Georgia in 2008. Maybe it was made after one of the other unpleasant things that Russia has done in the near abroad, perhaps the 2009 military exercise Zapad, which practiced the invasion of the Baltic states and culminated with an exercise in which there was a nuclear weapons strike on Warsaw rehearsed. Or maybe it was a bit earlier, maybe it was the time of the Putin speech at the old Wehrkunde, the Munich Security Conference. But no, it wasn't then, it wasn't even in this century. That speech was given in Hamburg at the Matthäusoper by Lennart Meri, President of the Republic of Estonia, on February the 25th, 1994. And that really is the first big point I want to make. If you think these problems with Russia are new, it shows that you have not been paying attention. Because we've been warned about these tendencies in Russia for nearly 30 years. We are warned by Estonians, by Latvians, by Lithuanians, by Poles, by Ukrainians, and by Russians themselves. And they went to Berlin and Brussels and Washington and London and Paris, and they said, watch out. Things are not going as well as you think in Russia. Yes, there is a kind of political pluralism. Yes, there is a kind of market economy. Yes, there is membership of international organizations, and they've signed up for international treaties. But that's not the whole story. The old KGB is still there. The thinking of the old KGB is still there. And worse, it's combined with elements of the organized crime world and elements of the natural resources, businesses, and elements of state administration. And it's a new kind of Russia, and it's not good for us, and it's not going to be good for you. And these people like Vytautas Landsbergis and Lennart Meri and other brave people, some of whom had suffered inside the Soviet Union very considerably, were not just ignored, they were patronized and belittled in Berlin and Brussels and Washington and London. They were told, you don't understand. We have a better understanding of Russia than you do. A Finnish politician, very famous Finnish politician, said the trouble with the Balts is they have post-traumatic stress disorder. Another American said they always come in running into the room with their hair on fire. Well, I'm sorry. They were right, and we in the Old West were wrong. We were catastrophically wrong. We were so wrong that thousands of people have died, chiefly 13,000 Ukrainians have died because of our mistakes. We misunderstood Russia really deeply. And we have to approach this now from a position of deep humility and contrition towards the people in the countries of Eastern Europe, the former captive nations, who have been warning us all this time. And it's particularly annoying, I think, that despite our systematic failure to get Russia right, our systematic indulgence of the Kremlin, both under Yeltsin and under Putin over many years, we are still trying to make the Ukrainians and Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians pay the price of our misapprehensions. It's perhaps the longest Magisterarbeit in internationale Sicherheitspolitik that anyone has ever undertaken, even by German standards. 30 years is a long time to spend on your postgraduate education in international security policy. And someone else is paying the bill. And we are still talking about neutrality for Ukraine, as if neutrality would protect Ukraine. Let us not forget, it was neutral Ukraine that signed the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 when it gave up its nuclear weapons. And That Budapest Memorandum was also signed by the Russian Federation, and the text is easily available on the internet. It says that the parties, the other nuclear powers, recognize and support and will protect the borders and the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of Ukraine in exchange for it giving up the nuclear weapons. And there was no footnote, no brackets saying, unless Ukraine has a government that the Russian Federation doesn't approve of. No, that was a promise. And if Russia will break a promise that it made to a neutral Ukraine in 1994, why should Ukrainians believe that Russia will maintain and hold to a promise it would make to a neutral Ukraine in 2022? Russia is not a trustworthy interlocutor in international security when it comes to the countries on its borders. You just have to look at the last 30 years and you can see that. So how dare we try and persuade the Ukrainians that we know better about their security? Now, there's been a lot of talk about NATO expansion, and I've been living and dealing with Eastern Europe, as we used to call it, since the mid-1980s. And the biggest driver of NATO's enlargement has not been NATO, it's not been the United States, certainly not been the West European countries, it's not been the arms industry, it's not been George Soros, it's not been any external force. The biggest driver of NATO expansion has been the Russian Federation. Russia saved NATO. If it had not been for the behavior of the Russian Federation outlined so brilliantly by Lennart Meri in 1994, so presciently, we would not have had countries pounding on NATO's door saying, let us in. First of all, the three, and then after that, the much bigger expansion. We now even see that even in Finland, in neutral or non-aligned, not neutral Finland, a majority of Finns, a large majority of Finns, say they would support joining NATO if their country's political leadership believed it's necessary. So let's not fall into the trap of believing Russian narratives about this crisis. This is a crisis that is created by Russia. It's created by Russia as a means of coercion in order to achieve long-standing Russian political goals. One of them is to isolate Ukraine, make the Ukrainians feel you have no friends in the West. They may send you helmets, they may finance a field hospital, but they are not going to do anything serious to defend you. And by demoralizing Ukraine, that paves the way for Ukraine's reabsorption into Russia's sphere of influence. At least that's what Putin thinks. But they're also highlighting the divisions in the West, and these are grievous and spectacular. We see Macron grandstanding. We see the extraordinary sight of the new German coalition government pursuing two different foreign policies. Your foreign minister talking, I think, a great deal of sense and going to Ukraine, and your chancellor talking rather less, and I think failing his first big foreign policy challenge. We see Italy taking a different route altogether, saying saying we don't want a conflict with Russia because we are so dependent on the gas. We see the European institutions utterly sidelined with no significant intervention from von der Leyen or from any of the others. We see Britain talking a great game but refusing to deal with the glaring task, the absolutely number one priority of dealing with the Russian dirty money which sloshes around the streets of London. And we see the American administration concluding that it cannot love Europe more than the Europeans love their own security. And ultimately, I think, taking a bit of a backseat, they're more worried about China. And all this Putin has achieved without escalating his attack on Ukraine any further. So I'm gloomy about this, I'm afraid. I'm angry with the Old West, and I'm particularly concerned, I'm afraid, about the inability of Germany to see the enormous geopolitical responsibilities that come with its enormous economic weight. I look forward very much to questions in the discussion.
Thank you, Edward, for outlining this perspective. So the Old West has been blind. The warnings which came from Central Eastern European states were dismissed, and problems with Russia are not new. And now Russia saved NATO was one I would like to, in a very rather shorter exchange, just place a few lines in the sand. First of all, in which situation are we? What is to be expected? First of all, at the moment we have Olympic Games. Do you trust that during the Olympic Games there will be peace in Ukraine? And if you can agree on that, what will be the next moment where you would look at that might be the window of time or decisive moment? Stephanie, peace during the Olympics, and when do we have to look again closer?
Well, I mean, I personally didn't thought that President Putin and Xi would like to mess up their own performance on the 4th of February. That was long planned, well orchestrated. They put a lot of effort in their joint statement. Yep. So that very moment, I didn't expect President Xi to fancy having a Russian president standing next to him on top of a military campaign. But the Olympic Games as such is, I would say, is not a decisive factor for the Russian president. We can obviously start guessing. Nobody knows what's really inside the head of President Putin. What I look at is the amassing of military force. And I look at a bit the diplomatic scheduling, but I think he could, he could actually move anytime. He has what we call in the military jargon the escalation initiative. He can march his troops uphill and downhill.
Mm-hmm. Edward, your take on the timeline, what to expect or not to expect, just also rather brief answers that we go to the next few pieces of the puzzle. And please unmute your mic.
I strongly doubt that there's going to be a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I covered the Chechen war, and to subdue even Chechnya was a big task. And although 100,000 troops sounds a lot, it's not anything like what you would need to do a full-scale military occupation of even part of Ukraine, let alone all of it. I think that it's possible we will get a provocation followed by some kind of precision strike, because this is asymmetric warfare. The Ukrainians can't strike inside Russian territory, but the Russians could send a missile to strike a target inside Ukrainian territory, possibly not causing many casualties, or maybe targeting a far-right militia or something like that, and then sit back and say to the West, now what are you going to do? But I think the key point, as Stephanie said earlier, Putin has the initiative, and we have let him have the initiative. We are sitting there arguing with ourselves about what we should do in order that he won't do something worse. That normalizes the status quo, which is actually abnormal, and gives him a huge range of possible options. And whatever he chooses, I'm afraid we don't have a proper answer for.
Another question already from our viewers was, when we come to the weapons question, it's a broad question, but the question was a little bit more narrow in the sense, how much weapons would Ukraine need to deter Putin? And I just add that in Germany, I often find a misunderstanding that it would be necessary to arm Ukraine to a degree that Ukraine would be ready to win a war with Russia. That's of course not possible, but the idea is a totally different one. Makes the price as high that Putin considers twice whether for domestic reasons it's not very popular to have a war, to see coffins come back to, or whatever. So if you could both a little bit elaborate on these questions, what would be the goal? And if you want to comment also this criticism in Germany, would Germany had anything sensible to offer at any rate, or is it rather the United States, maybe a little bit Britain, who are doing this part of the task? Edward, would you go first this time, and then Stephanie comment?
I do find it absolutely extraordinary that the Federal Republic of Germany will sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, given what's going on in Yemen, but doesn't want to allow Estonia to send some GDR-era howitzers to Ukraine. This sends a very, very bad message, and it's the sight of the British cargo plane having to fly round Germany on its way to Ukraine to deliver some anti-tank weapons I think is the enduring image of the division of Europe. I think there's a misapprehension. Ukraine as a country of 40 million people is not going to win a war against Russia, not least Russia's a nuclear power. If they start letting off nuclear weapons, there's nothing anybody's going to do about it. But I think that Ukraine is already put itself in a reasonable defensive posture to make it clear that an invasion is not going to be easy for Russia. This is not going to be 2014 Crimea. And I would like us to send more anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons to Ukraine, but nothing we do is going to be enough for Ukraine to be able to win a one-on-one war with Russia. What we have to do is to say to the Russians, what you're doing is outrageous, and we are already going to put a lot of pressure on you. It's not a case of if you do more, we will do X. We should already be doing X. We should be leaving Putin with an enormous headache, asking what on earth can I do to make the West stop doing these things? We can do it with visas, not letting Kremlin cronies come to Western countries. We can do it with asset freezes. We can do it with a whole range of normative, legal, financial, other instruments, which will make life extremely unpleasant for the Kremlin. And we should have started this months ago.
Stephanie, your thoughts on the deterrence question?
Very much agree here with Edward in terms of altering the military balance. Hardly anything we can do in order to help the Ukrainian military capabilities really significantly. Just to give you one figure, I mean, following 2014, the Ukrainians lost roughly 70% of their naval capabilities. That's nothing, I mean, that you can rebuild overnight. NATO, EU, individual allies, bilateral help, all that has certainly improved certain aspects of the Ukrainians' military posture, as Edward has said. But to put it very, very bluntly, for me, this is still David against Goliath. So it is whatever we said. That will not really change the calculus of a nuclear-armed Moscow. But I would very much like to go along with what Edward said in terms of putting more pressure on Russia. I maintain the argument I already put forward very early in the crisis. I mean, that we should have put an ultimatum to Russia and put sanctions the minute they actually started to amass the troops, and not put the sanctions in the back and wait for them, I mean, to cross the border. I find this a bit illogical, but here we go.
I would stay a moment again with explaining or trying to understand what the German government is doing before the question about the weapons was put by Herbert Klein. And now Frank Birke asked why it's so difficult for Germans to step in other countries' views. Why is it so difficult for us to understand that? Germany gets a lot of criticism, and much more than any other European country, which is interesting because on the other hand, I'm asked by ambassadors, media persons from other European countries, can you explain to me why Germany gets so much criticism? More or less France, Italy, the Netherlands, whoever you look for, they're having the same course. They're not doing more, they're not sending weapons, but the Germans get all the criticism. And then, of course, one could argue, well, because the German posture is not very convincing. As Edward has said, we are saying out of principle, we are not sending weapons to a conflict country, but we are doing it. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Israel. The historic argument is not convincing, because if that would be true, that we can't give weapons to a country which might find itself someday in war with Russia, then we can't arm our NATO partners, because that makes no sense. And we have responsibility also towards Ukraine. And the last point, if Germany sends weapons, then it would not be longer able to have a position as an interpreter, as somebody who tries to find a solution. Well, the US is sending weapons, but Putin is begging the US to engage in all these kinds of talks. So I think the Germans get the flag because what they are saying is very principled, but not convincing. But give me your take. What should the German, can you explain why the German government is finding itself in such a situation? And a little bit you elaborate already what they should do. Please, Edward, you have your hands up.
Yes, I don't know if anyone who's on this call has watched the Spider-Man movies. There may not be much overlap, but I believe from taking my children to it, there's the Spider-Man's motto is that with great power comes great responsibility. And I think what is so infuriating, and I mean that, about Germany's stance is that Germany has enormous power. You are the economic giant in Europe. And because you're the economic giant, you have enormous potential power, whether it's in your dealings with the People's Republic of China, or whether it's in your role as an energy exporter, or whether it's in your role as your role in multilateral organizations, but you are far bigger than any other European country. And yet you don't use that power responsibly. You actually export instability by what you're doing. And for countries to the east of Poland, of Germany, that's really frightening. They feel that you are putting your economic interests ahead of the interests of the rest of Europe, that you are willing to do side deals, whether it's with China or with Russia, that ignore the interests of smaller countries, and they don't feel safe. They feel aggrieved. For those of them that were victims of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, they feel really outraged. And I would note Artis Pabriks, my friend who's the Latvian foreign minister, spoke very bluntly on this. You have a historical responsibility to the countries between you and Russia, and you're not discharging it. And I'm sorry to put it so bluntly, but that's the fact. And if you start taking their security seriously, then everything will improve. But until you do, it won't.
Before I ask Stephanie for her thoughts and comments, I just would like to mention that the German government defends itself with the hints that, for example, we are doing a lot. For example, if you look in which country are Ukrainian soldiers cared for, which have been wounded in the war, that's Germany. You could go at any time to the Berlin hospitals, you would find them there. Of course, these 5,000 helmets were dismissed as not enough, and and everybody can understand that. But on the other hand, the Germans say we are for years now in discussions with Ukrainians. They never ask us officially to do more. Everything what they ask us to do, we deliver. So just to put the arguments on the other side on the table. Now, Stephanie, your thoughts. Why is Germany so much under criticism, having not a very different stance from France or Italy, and what should we do?
Stop whining about it. Stop whining about it and simply accept, yes, we have been looked at for at least 2 decades as a power in Europe that smaller countries, other countries in Europe would like to see leadership qualities from, deriving from. And we don't fulfill that promise. Radek Sikorski, his famous quote, is something which has been resurfaced in recent years, that he was in recent weeks and days saying that he doesn't fear a too strong Germany, but rather a too weak Germany in Europe. Weak in terms of leadership qualities, abilities. But you know, I'm a rather practical person, probably because I spent some 20 years in a multilateral organization. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, you need to look at the issue from a broader perspective. I mean, we need to, as I tried to make clear in my intro remarks, we need to try to close the ranks, which is already a political difficult thing to do. And I see a lot of backdoor diplomacy trying to go into this in order to make sure that at least from a public point of view, we, NATO, EU, I mean, we look more or less united and active. Number 2, we need to get out of this defensive corner in which Putin so skillfully has managed to, push us in. And slowly we're seeing, I mean, that there is a little bit more on the activity front. But at the end of the day, what we need to do, we need to look at the package. This is not just about Ukraine. This is about the proposals put forward by the Russians to reorganize the European security architecture that we have established post-Cold War. So we need to really put some smart thinking into what is it, what are the best arguments that we can put forward to actually to maintain what we think should be maintained, and at the same time also take advantage of Russia's at least partly expressed interest in order to go back, I mean, to arms negotiations, military transparency and risk reduction issues and the like. And I personally find the letter that has been put forward by Washington and sent back to Moscow, I mean, quite a good start. I mean, somebody really smart and skillfully drafted these couple of pages. There is a lot in for the Russians. So the question now is, I mean, how we can translate that into pressure that we can put to Putin, and that will be diplomatically and politically quite an uphill struggle.
With respect to our time, I will now try to put two questions into one to both to you. The broader field is, are we so sure that there will be a no stop to NATO expansion? That was, of course, the principled answer by Washington, by others as well. We can't give that to Putin, that he has some sort of veto whether NATO accepts additional members. And that's not only a Ukraine question, it's also a question of the EU, but no NATO countries like Finland, like Sweden, maybe Austria, also interesting example when we talk about neutrality between the blocs. But so Mr. Zengel from Switzerland asks about that, but I would like to put it in a broader context. What we're seeing at the moment is a diversification of diplomacy. Scholz went to Washington, Macron went to Moscow, Scholz will go to Moscow. Is this all good? Or is there rather a danger that the West will talk with different tongues, and that's good for Putin? Who calls the shots in all these questions? Is it in the end the United States? Is it Germany? Is it France? Is it the European Union? Is it NATO? So who calls the shot, and what about this perspective? Couldn't we give in some unofficial way to Putin at least? Nobody is talking for the next 10 years about taking Ukraine in as a NATO member. Stephanie, would you go first, and then Lucas, just to change always a little bit with who's first, who comes second?
Very quickly, in my conversations with Russians in recent weeks, and also what I observe from media and press statements, I'm very strongly under the impression that the Premier League focus of the Kremlin is and will remain with Washington. I mean, whatever we Europeans try to come up with in terms of crisis diplomacy and meetings and visits and phone calls, all nice to have for Mr. Putin. He certainly feels courted in some way, sadly so. But the Kremlin looks at Washington, full stop. Yeah? So whatever we Europeans come up with in terms of our own ideas, we need to really fine-tune them, synchronize them as best as possible, as closely as possible with the Americans. And this is, I think, what we've seen in the recent two letters I keep on referring to. The NATO response was very much aligned to the US response letter to the Kremlin. And that's important because, as you and Edward have also alluded to, one of the Kremlin policies has always been in the past 10 plus years and more to play divide et impera, to split both European Union members as well as NATO members, which is not a new news. Yeah, I mean, we know that. Yeah, and we've been struggling with that all along. But the ball, I think, is very much between Washington and the Kremlin.
And to try to take the US out of the commitment for Europe. Edward, your thoughts about, can there be any proposal concerning NATO expansion or not expansion for some years? Who calls the shots? Who really makes these decisions? 2008, it was France and Germany who stopped the accession of Ukraine and Georgia. And sometimes I can even have people who ask me, at least, whether that was a mistake at that time not to take Ukraine in. But if we would really feel more secure if Ukraine would be on paper a NATO member, but with no real infrastructure to defend it, that's maybe also not a solution. But your thoughts, Edward, not mine.
It was the 2008 Bucharest summit was a disaster because we gave Ukraine a promise without the political will to implement that promise. And I think it would have been better either to have brought Ukraine into NATO much earlier or not to have given the promise at all, but this was a halfway house, which has caused us a lot of problems, and I agree with that. I think there is no circumstance in which we are going to see a formal or informal ban on NATO expansion, because if we do that, it's devastating for Finland and for Sweden. These countries very much need to have the NATO option in case things go badly wrong or go worse wrong, or even just carry on as they are in Russia. And we've seen really intense Russian, don't forget, we saw a dummy military attack by Russia on Good Friday 2013 on the Swedish air headquarters and another important installation. We've seen a lot of Russian military pressure on Gotland, both with different sorts of subversion and other things going on that island. And we've had a dummy attack on Bornholm, a Danish island. So there's a whole, and there's all sorts of problems in that the Finns have experienced as well. So the idea that we could say to these countries, you're not going to join NATO, would be an open invitation to Russia for more mischief making. We're not going to do that. And I agree with Stephanie. The big point here is that Russia has humiliated Europe. It said to the Europeans, you don't have a say in your own security. When push comes to shove, when the chips are down, at the end of the day, we talk to the Americans about you. And it's extraordinary to me that Europeans put up with that. Europe is bigger and richer than the United States. It could have a voice in its own affairs, and it chooses not to. And the main reason I'm afraid it chooses not to is because of the German unwillingness to think strategically. You asked what Germany should do. I would say one very important thing Germany should do is to get seriously involved in Baltic security, the security around the Baltic Sea. Stop foot dragging, get your military mobility going, make sure the JSEC headquarters in Ulm is working properly, make sure the Bundesbahn has the capacity to get troops across Europe properly, fast, speedily. There's an enormous agenda for the military, improving military mobility and for the maritime and air security of the Baltic Sea. In all of those, Germany is a vital role, and Germany is not trusted at the moment by the other countries because they think if there's a crisis, you will say, nein, nein, bitte Dialog statt Konfrontation, um Gottes Willen, kein Krieg. And you will leave your East European neighbours in the lurch. And that is actually a cause of instability rather than stability.
Let's stay a moment with this question. To which degree is Germany reliable or not reliable, and what do we mean by that? Is this foot dragging that Chancellor Scholz, even in Washington, couldn't put the words Nord Stream 2 on his lips and make clear that in a case of conflict, war, aggression, the pipeline is dead? Does that mean that there's any doubt that the pipeline would be dead? Because indirectly he admitted it. He said, when it comes to sanctions and consequences of an armed attack, there are no differences which steps we would take after President Biden had said, well, that would mean stop of Nord Stream 2. And I personally can't imagine German authorities given the go to Nord Stream 2 at a moment when we see armed conflict from Russia to Ukraine. So what does it mean, unreliability? Is it rather that Chancellor Scholz should say more, but we are rather sure that he would follow through, even if he's not saying right now? Or are there real doubts what he would do, whether the West would split up in the case of armed conflict? Stephanie and then Edward.
The very fact that we keep on talking about why Chancellor Scholz has difficulties to pronounce the term Nord Stream 2, I mean, is answer to some of that. Yeah, I mean, you need to, in your stratcom and your strategic communication, you need to be crystal clear. I understand that at least partly he looks at his own party base, perhaps, or he looks at the Prime Minister of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. I don't know of whom else he looks in this, but it's a mistake. I mean, to not really be crystal clear. The second that comes to my mind is that it's one thing, I mean, to go to Washington and to say we are a reliable partner, and then in the next sentence to stress financial commitments in the first place. I mean, that's also let's say, part of our reputation. I mean, that Germany is very often looked at as, yes, I mean, they are willing to pay, they are going to be easy and nice in terms of providing financial funding. But when it really comes to sending military hardcore assets, being really fully behind, there are questions. At least what I'm portraying here is something that I heard over the past 10, 12 or 15 years in NATO corridors over and over again. So making that point is also a little bit ambivalent. Third, a bit late in the game, the German defense minister has now announced, I mean, to put in 350 extra personnel to our battle group in Lithuania. Good enough, yeah, not bad. But also this is a matter of timing. I mean, she should have done that. The German government should have done it much earlier and not once you are pressed, yeah, if you, so it's not really convincing by many others. So yeah, reliability, I'm really afraid to say so. I'm just talking here about my own experience. There are very often question marks to Germans' reliability, yes.
Edward?
The first time.
Yes, I mean, you know, the fact you even built Nord Stream 1 was an affront to your East European neighbours. And then you built Nord Stream 2, and that is counted as normal. We will cancel Nord Stream 2 if Russia does some extra new bad thing. And this is a devastating blow to the energy security of the countries to your east. And it's odd to me, no one realizes it. I remember going to the German energy ministry in, I think, 2006 to talk about gas dependency. And I was laughed at. They said, are you seriously saying, Herr Lukas, that Russia would use gas as a weapon? A bit later, I was at another meeting with the German government, and they said, are you seriously saying, Herr Lukas, that Russia would use information as a weapon? That was about 2010, I think. And now we see that Russia absolutely uses gas as a weapon, absolutely uses information as a weapon, absolutely uses money as a weapon. And on all these things, we have things we can do. Nobody put tanks going down the streets of Berlin saying, build a pipeline to Russia, otherwise we will blow up the Kanzleramt. No, you did it because you were naive and complacent and, you know, greedy and whatever, just the same way we opened our financial system to Russian dirty money. Although nobody made us do it, we were greedy and naive and complacent and so on. Now, the thing about these self-inflicted things is you can undo them. We can say to the Russians, every molecule of gas that goes through these pipelines is going to be under the strictest supervision of the EU competition authorities. We can do, yeah, Russia has created a bit of gas dependency on Europe. We can turn that round and start saying to the Russians, we're your biggest customer, treat us nicely. There's plenty we can do. We just choose not to do it.
With regard to the time, one last question. What the US is trying to do to change the course and the subjects of the talks. You elaborated a little bit already on that, going away from the Russian demands to an offer, let's talk security. Let's talk about a new agreement, arms control on mid-size range weapons. Let's make sure that the START treaty will be prolonged and not running out. Let's talk about agreements on conventional forces and so on and so on. And yes, we are ready to give you a guarantee that NATO will not attack Russia, but we want also the guarantee that Russia will not attack ABC. So that it's mutual agreement, not just from one side. To which degree can we end on a little bit happier note that maybe there is some silver lining on the horizon, that this might develop into an opportunity, the crisis, or is this rather wishful thinking? Edward, you first, and then Stephanie, and the two of you have together 2 minutes.
Well, briefly, there is a large agenda we can start on. The arms control is absolutely central to this. We had arms control talks with the Brezhnev Kremlin. We can certainly have arms talks with the Putin Kremlin. A lot of these agreements have fallen apart because of Russian misbehavior, but not all of them. I think the Americans have given some cause for concern on the Russian side. There's certainly plenty we can talk about. So I'd start on that. And I'd secondly say, let's have a new Helsinki process. But looking at the digital age, let's look at all these questions of individual and business and collective digital security and see if we can find some common ground on that. Russia is an advanced industrialized economy, and all advanced industrialized economies have the similar worries about how to make the digital economy work. So by all means talk, but let's talk with a clear aim in mind, and not, I repeat, not at the expense of the countries that do not have at the moment such a say in their own affairs.
Stephanie?
I fully agree with Edward. There is plenty to talk about, plenty good incentives for the Russians, but also I think for us on the Western side to re-establish dialogue on transparency issues, risk reduction issues, cyberspace, you name it. The big question mark to me is, will Russian President Putin buy into it? And I'd say not yet. For him, the casus belli will remain enlargement, and Ukraine in particular. That's my strong assumption. But we have to see. I don't want to, and how can I possibly preempt Moscow's response? But let's see.
Well, so it's a very open situation. That's we end where we started. I thank Edward and Stephanie for their insight, and I think we were able to put an international perspective on the whole thing. It was not just about Germany and what we are doing here, also how this is perceived and what are the expectations. I thank also the participants, especially those who took part in the Q&A. Please stay healthy, please stay safe. And with that, I would give it back to Patrick Walz, if you have a last few words. And I thank everybody for attending. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for this lively discussion. If I can sum it up, I would say it's not as bleak as we might think, because most of the blame lies with us and us as the Western world, if I can sum it up like that. And that's one thing we can change. It's easier to change oneself than others. So I take that away from this discussion, that it's not, well, it's up to us to do something about this situation, and not only this, but about Europe as a voice on a global level. It's up to us. Why do we have to look to Washington if we can do certain things or not? I think the EU had great goals when it was founded, and I guess we can still aim for them. So thank you very much for this talk, which for all its bleakness offers some hope at redemption. And I'm very much looking forward to other talks with you and other experts on security issues on Eastern Europe, because I think this is a topic that will follow us, and we should keep running with this. So thank you very much for your contributions. Thank you very much for your moderation, and see you soon on this channel. Goodbye and have a nice